Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. We hope that you are all safe and healthy, and we're glad that you've joined us today. This is a live session, and you'll be able to pose questions for the presenter at the end of the webinar. If questions come to mind during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A area in your Zoom control panel. And if you miss anything, don't worry. We'll send a link to the recorded session when it's available. Throughout the webinar, you'll see poll questions related to the webinar topic. You can respond from the device that you're using to view the webinar. My name is Amy Chamberlain, and I'm an instructional designer at the CE Shop, the leading provider of online real estate education. Today, we're reviewing the principles of value as this topic relates to your licensing exam, presented by Vincent White. Vincent is a certified real estate instructor in several states and comes to us with more than 30 years of real estate experience. Now let's see what information Vincent has to share with us.
The agenda for the day is understanding concepts and principles of value. One of the things I want to ask is how long are you in your course? The graph shown is a graph of exam topics, and they give you proportions share of how many questions may be on an exam. It is just an example. Your exam, rather administered by another proxy, may have more or less of the percentages. But as a value as a whole, these are the normal percentages that you are going to be asked upon your state or federal exam. Now, today we're talking about valuation. And as you can see, valuation is about 7% of the total questions asked. And that 7% could be extremely important. But again, this is how you focus your energies and your time. Now, you can always refer to your candidate handbook for more detailed information regarding percentage of questions asked. By now, you've taken this course, participated in the course, you've come to understand that terms are as equally important as the concept. And as a matter of fact, if you can understand the vocabulary associated with the content, you are more likely to be successful in the passing of the exam. So let's look at a few terms. Price. What is price? Price is what a buyer paid for a property and what the seller has accepted. How about value? Now, value is someone's opinion of what a property is worth. Not just what now, not just in the present, but future anticipated value. Cost is what would it cost to replace that property if it disappeared off the face of the earth today. So these are important terms to think about and understand. The next topic we want to talk about is understanding supply and demand. And this is a very important concept to understand because it aligns itself with other topics by now which you may have reviewed. But understanding the supply and demand, or the principle of supply and demand, is extremely important. So what is supply and demand? Supply is simply the number of goods or services that's out on the market. Demand is what? It is how highly that is sought. How willing is a consumer to purchase what is out there? Now, in real estate terms, this comes to be real simple. In real estate, if we say what is supply, supply is the amount of homes on the market. And demand is the amount of buyers seeking that product, which is housing. But for another example, let's talk about this. The spring market is coming. And we know if in the spring market there is an abundance of property, i.e. supply on the market, and a low demand, i.e. buyers looking for that product, then it's more than likely that the housing prices would drop. Conversely, if that spring market has a low supply of properties on the market and a high number of buyers, then it's more likely that the cost of that housing will increase. Let me share another example of this concept. In your childhood, you may have played on what we would call a teeter-totter or a seesaw. And if you know anything, when you were playing, it was all about weight. Weight distributed the balance of that seesaw. Demand is no different. Supply and demand is a substitute for that weight. And while you remember trying to balance your weight against the other party's weight, it's a bit challenging to get it just right. And there's no other way to describe the housing market. To get supply and demand just right is a bit of a challenge. And what would be the factors that would affect that? What are the challenges that would affect supply and demand? Well, there's a number of them. And we're going to talk a little bit about them. Obviously, one of the demands is the amount of supply. You may be in a market that can be described as a buyer's market. And that market is characterized because there's a lot of property on the market. And that supply of property is low. Now, you could also be in a market that's described as a seller's market. And the seller's market is just the opposite. There are a high number of buyers, i.e. demand, and there's not an infinite supply of housing. And as a result, housing prices are high. I'm often think about New York. Currently, New York rental market can be described as a tenant's market. Why? Because a lot of people have left the area, or left New York City and moved elsewhere, creating an abundance of rental property. The buyers or tenants are in low demand. Hence, it's a tenant's market. And the rental prices have come down. Now, there's other factors that affect supply and demand. And one of those is, you might have heard this old saying, buy land because they're not making it anymore. And there's a caveat there. I think they are making it in Hawaii. But the wisdom in saying it is that there's a fixed supply of land. There's a fixed supply of land. And as a result, demand is going to focus on that fixed supply, i.e. the scarcity of that. And with that demand comes that balancing act between supply and goods. But how does this work in real estate? Well, you might have also heard the saying, location, location, location. And that refers to, let's say we have a subdivision, and there's a certain uniqueness of properties. Even though they may be the same style and size, there's a uniqueness to every property. In the subdivision, you may have a property that's on a corner or in a cul-de-sac. And those properties may have a perceived value, more or less, depending upon the buyer. And so we know location affects that demand. Even when everything else appears to be the same, the differences will be perceived as a value to a particular buyer. Let's give another example, is living in a ski resort or oceanfront property. Now, there's not a lot of oceanfront properties compared to other type of properties. But because of their scarcity, they have value. And people are willing to pay more for that product in a scarce environment. The same as if you had a property in the mountains, in the ski resorts. Again, there's not a lot of that type of property, hence the scarcity. Hence, the scarcity is feeding the demand, and people are willing to pay more for that property. So location plays a role. People's preference plays a role. Construction plays a role. The current market is that goods for construction or for building of properties is hard to come by and expensive. A builder is going to build a house and pass those costs on to the buyer. Hence, the property is going to increase in price, which may put some buyers in a position to purchase, but may eliminate the other buyers because of the high price. The other way that construction plays a part in supply and demand is a builder may recognize that a certain style of home is in demand. It could be a 2-bedroom, it could be a 3-bedroom home with an in-law suite. And that builder may set out to build that product. And because normally it's slow in that process, the builder may be able to take advantage of that demand. And when she does, then the property demand drops off and the builder then will build to the second demand. Another important portion of understanding supply and demand is the local market, i.e., let's say the labor supply. And we talk about the labor supply in relationships to demographics, which is the study of characteristics of the population. If demographics of that population would indicate that the particular buyer is of a certain age, or let's say it's a baby boomer or a millennial, then that's going to impact upon what is being built. It's going to impact upon the supply based on the demand. And we know demographics is different, and of course it's different. But for example, certain areas of the nation, i.e. Florida, has a demographic that supports a certain type of housing. And that housing has been built mainly to that demographic. We know in other areas, Arizona, again, the supply has been built mostly to satisfy a particular population. And then we have economic forces. Economic forces is simply this: how many people are gainfully employed? How many people are gainfully employed to be able to purchase the supply? And the more people that are gainfully employed, the wages, are they sufficient, would feed a demand for supply for a certain type of housing. So supply and demand has influences that affect it. Construction, style, economic, and labor forces. These combine is that balancing act that we talk about on that teeter or that supply, or that swing. Getting them just right will help you understand, or will help to understand how supply and demand works in your area. So let's take a minute, ask the question. When supply is lower than demand, which of the following could be expected? Prices will likely fall, so it's a buyer's market. Prices will likely fall, so it's a seller's market. Prices would likely rise, so it's a buyer's market. The answer is prices will likely rise. So it's a seller's market. Can you identify the factors that influence value? Take a minute and write them down, at least what you think the factors that affect value. And we've given you a little bit of clues. DUST, D-U-S-T. Now, DUST stands for demand, utility, scarcity, and transferability. Now, demand is a good concept, is an excellent concept to understand, and it's the basis for really determining how the factors of value influence one another. We talked a little bit earlier about demand. What is it? It's a bit of a popularity contest. How attractive and move-in is the property? What's the market like? Are there any more buyers than sellers or vice versa? What amenities affect demand? And then for a property to have value, it has to have utility. And another word for utility is use. That relates to the property's function. Is it habitable? Is it in good condition? Or what is the condition is it? Does it need updating? Repairs? Does the current zoning match the intended use? And if a buyer wants commercial property, but the zoning is residential, how does this impact value? Scarcity. We already talked about or mentioned that scarcity as it relates to the supply of land is a low supply, i.e. there's no more of land, there's no more land being made. How does it relate to property? Is related to demand. We talked about oceanfront property. We talked about ski resort property. We know that there's not an infinite amount of that, hence the scarcity gives a perception of value, and people are willing to pay for that, even though it could be referred to as high cost. So studying economics, we know that supply and demand are price drivers, and scarcity is a part of that. The fewer the properties there are on the market, the greater the scarcity, the higher the demand, and the higher demand pushes prices upward. How easy is it to transfer the property? Transferability. And that's about how easy is it for the seller to convey the property to someone else. There are factors such as restrictions, clouds on title, tenants in place that make it more difficult to transfer the property. And if that's the case, it reduces the value. DUST, utility, scarcity, transferability, all play a role that influence value. Let's take a moment to answer a question. Which one of the following characteristics would most likely be impacted if unemployment rates continue to increase in a given area? If you answered demand, you would be correct. We know that if unemployment rates continue, then people are less likely to have income to purchase a property. Thus, demand would more likely fall. Let's take a minute and talk about the 9 principles of value. Just write them down to the best of your recollection, what they are, and then we'll talk about them. If you wrote down anticipation, competition, conformity, contribution, highest and best use, plottage, regression, progression, and substitution, then you got them all right. Let's further talk about these principles of value after we ask this question. Okay. Which of the following statements best describes the principle of anticipation? Give that some thought. And if you answered the value of the property is based on expected future earnings, then you've got that correct. So let's talk about these 9 important principles of value. The first one is anticipation. And as that word sort of describes, anticipation is about expectations. What's coming soon. The movie industry always teases us by using trailers about an upcoming movie, just piquing our interest. But in real estate, anticipation is sort of the same. In practice, it's about anticipating present and future values of properties. Present and future value of properties. Is there a rumor of a large distribution company coming in an area? Is there a rumor of highway development coming through an area? Is there an expectation that the property is going to increase in value or decrease in value due to any of those circumstances? And so this is an important part in terms of the valuation basis. It's tied to the benefits that it may offer the buyers for the future. Let's take another example of this. Let's say that there's expectations that a neighborhood that's designed for families, right, has no schools. The schools have not been built yet, right? Now, there's an indication that a school or playground is going to be in the works, a coming soon sort of situation. Then what happens? The anticipated value of that property increases, right? So this is probably what I would say common sense, but yet not to the point that we should overlook it. Anticipation. Now, one of the values we mentioned is the principle of competition. Now, what is that related to, especially in real estate? Now, truthfully, it's related to a number of things, and I'm going to talk about some of them that's mentioned, but it's about supply and demand. Now, in real estate, residential real estate, it's simply about how many other properties similar are on the market to the one that you would be listing, that you are trying to sell. Obviously, the more properties, similar properties that is on the market would have what type of effect to your listing? It would lower the demand, possibly, right? It would be priced accordingly. Now, competition also relates to excess profits. For example, have you ever noticed that where there's a Burger King, there is a McDonald's? Or where there's a fast food restaurant of some type, there is another fast food restaurant of some type. Why? Because that's about competition. It's about excess profits. And that no one entity, no one business can have all the profits. but as a whole, it drives the profits down. Let me give you another example. Back in the 90s, there was one person, one principal building self-storage. They were the only company doing that. As you look around now, there's many of companies in that industry. Because of profits, it spurred competition. And because of competition, there are more businesses that have entered that particular market. And as it relates, although profits are there, the profits that was experienced in the 80s or 90s have been reduced. Conformity. Does it conform to the neighborhood? And basically what that question is asking, what this principle is asking, is that there are times that there are unique properties around. And you build in, when you build a property or a home, more than likely you want it to conform to the neighborhood that you're building into. Why? Because by doing so, it's more likely to increase or maintain the value of that property. Conformity is always a better option. Developers, as unique as they want their properties to be, they want them to blend in and conform to existing neighborhoods. If you don't have a property that conforms, i.e., you may have a 4-bedroom home in a neighborhood of 2-bedroom ranches. The value of that 4-bedroom home, due to its lack of conformity to the 2-bedroom ranches, will be negatively impacted. It does not conform. And that could be vice versa. You could have a 2-bedroom ranch in a community of 3 to 4-bedroom, 2-story homes. The ranch is going to have a negative, or being the ranch does not conform to that neighborhood, and thus more than likely its value is going to be negatively impacted. Contribution. The question that comes to mind is, does adding things, and I think that's basically what we're talking about. Contribution is about adding value. How do you add value? Some people may say you add value by, I want a new kitchen. Will the costs associated with the new kitchen, adding a new kitchen, detract or add from value? Now, for you or me, we may be, sure, it adds. But also keep in mind, it has to add value from the perception of the buyer. Not everything is obvious. For example, there's a property owner who decides to add an in-law suite as a place for him or her to house additional family. So they build the property they build the addition for X number of dollars, let's say $50,000. They decide to sell the property. Well, the potential buyer of that property may be a single person or a new family who's just starting. Would that in-law suite detract or add to their perception of value? We don't know, but we know that that's a determination made by the buyer. Now, it could be the converse. It could be the buyer has that need, has that need or sees that perceived value, future benefit from that value, then are they willing to pay the market price for that home? Contribution, does it add or detract from value? And as an owner, you may not have the answer to that question until the buyer shows up. Highest and best use. Now, more than likely, this term is used mostly for commercial properties. It may be obvious that a residential property is going to be a residential property. It may be obvious, but it's not always. So this notion of highest and best use comes into play. For example, if you have a restaurant, it's unlikely that that restaurant is going to be used for housing. One, it's not, as we would say, does not have the amenities to be a house. Two, the zoning is not going to allow it. And thus the highest and best use for that property is probably going to be a restaurant. And then let's add the fact that the zoning more than likely would prohibit a gas station being used for residential. So the highest and best use is related to future benefits, but it's also related to income and the site. When I say site, I mean how the property is positioned on the land. So we say a gas station is unlikely to be used as a residence, a family residence, then a family residence would be unlikely to be used as a gas station. So highest and best use is the maximum use of a property based on its location. Could that be changed? Sure. Has it been changed? Sure. But as a whole, when you're looking at this term, it's more related to commercial and it's more related to zoning that exists currently for the property that you are being considered to place on the market. Plottage. Also, you see the word assemblage. So what is plottage? Plottage is converting two lots. And let's say the value of those lots are $20,000 per lot. So you have two lots valued at $20,000 per lot. If I join those two lots, I possibly now have a lot that exceeds the value of those two lots. So I can go from two separate values of 20,000 to a value of maybe 80,000 if I combine, if I joined those two lots. So plottage is about, and when I say it's not always a 1 and 1 equals 2, it could be 1 and 1 equals 4 or 5, depending on the size of the lots. Now, assemblage is another term associated with plottage, but that term is the joining. The act of joining those two lots is called assemblage. The merger of those two lots is called plottage. Keep that in mind. Regression. Now, regression sounds pretty much like what it sounds, means pretty much like what it sounds. Regression is the loss of value to a property because of another property's lack of upkeep, lack of appearance. You will often hear the term, if you've not already, that find me the worst house in the best neighborhood. That's an old adage. And it's old adage because people have found that if they find the worst house in the best neighborhood, the nicer properties will increase the value of that worst house, combined with obviously repairs and maintenance. So regression is this notion more than as a principle that affects how people view properties of lesser value in their neighborhood, or it could be located outside their neighborhood. People in a nicer neighborhood may hear rumors, anticipation, we talked about that there is a fast food establishment coming close to their neighborhood. They may fear that that restaurant would have a negative impact upon value, i.e., it would be regressive to their property values. So remember, regression, loss of value of a higher value property due to a property of lower value within the neighborhood. Progression is just the opposite, where you have a loss of value in a neighborhood due to a negatively maintained property. You now have the situation just the opposite, an ugly duckling. How does that ugly duckling gain value? By positioning itself with higher value properties. So when you think of regression, don't overthink of the term regression and progression. They're interrelated and they're the opposites. One is detracting from value from associated properties, and one is gaining in value from associated properties. So let's ask the question, which approach to value is based on substitution? The choices are the cost approach, the income approach, the sales comparison approach, and the gross rent multiplier. The correct answer is the sales comparison approach. So what is your favorite principle of value? Mine is competition. So what to expect on the state exam? One of the best ways to find out is to check your candidate handbook. In that handbook will be the total number of questions. It will give you a passing score. What's expected to pass on that exam? And the candidate book handbook is a good example, is a good is a good tool to use to find out what to study, what percentages of questions are asking, and it gives you an overall sense of what to expect. Now, one of the things is that you may have, on your state exam, there will be additional questions. There may be additional questions. Whereas the candidate handbook may say you're going to have 100 questions on your state exam. You sit down and in reality, you have 105 questions. Well, no, we did not make a mistake. The handbook did not make a mistake. But in the state exams, they may have additional questions, what we call experimental questions. There could be 5 to 10. Now relax. Those questions aren't graded. And when you answer those questions, your timer will stop. You will not know the questions. They're not highlighted as experimental questions, but they will add to the total number of questions. So do not be alarmed if your exam has 5 to 10 additional questions. These are experimental questions, and they do not affect your grade, nor do they affect the amount of time it takes for you to answer the exam. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Vincent. We will take some time for questions now. Just as a reminder, please be sure to type your questions into the Q&A in your control panel. And it looks like we have a few questions. The first one is, what is the difference, Vincent, between assemblage and plottage?
The difference between assemblage and plottage is plottage is the joining of two lots, lot A and B becomes lot C. That is plottage. Now, the assembling of those lots, how those lots get assembled is how those lots get joined is assemblage. So let's look at it this way. I have an idea that lot A and lot B, I'd like to what? Combine. I'd like to combine them into plottage. Now, the next step is assembling those into one lot. So that's how the difference between plottage and assemblage.
Thank you. Can you also please give us some examples of contribution?
Sure. Now, as we mentioned, contribution is about adding value. Let's give an example. I decide that I'd like my basement finished. And that cost of my basement, finishing my basement or a basement, is $15,000. So the contribution to the house is a finished basement at a cost of $15,000. Will that subsequent cost expenditure relate to value? Will my property home be $15,000 more? Not necessarily. As I mentioned, that is in the perception of the buyer. The buyer may not have a need for a finished basement or not view it valuably, and hence not have a perception of value. On the other hand, the buyer could be a family or an individual who desires space, additional space for hobbies, for recreational, for business, and that finished basement may add a perception of value.
Okay, thank you. And also, will there be separate questions that address assemblage and plottage?
Yes, there will be separate questions, and I would urge you to go to a real estate glossary. There are many on the web, but there are also real estate dictionaries. And the nuances between plottage and assemblage are narrow, but you will get a question on those two functions of value. And it's important to know the difference, that joining, plottage, assembling that, turning that into one lot is called assemblage. And it's an important concept. And I think it's a concept that you really should focus on, because you don't want to get one question unnecessarily wrong.
That's a good point. Okay, let's ask this one. Related to the principles of value and plottage, how can two properties valued at, for example, $20,000 increase in value to more than $40,000?
That's an excellent question. I'll give you an example. Let's say parcel A is an existing property. Let's say it's a gas station. And let's say behind it is parcel B, and parcel C. And they were once retail establishments. One was a cleaners, and maybe the other was a farm fresh produce stand, and they're separate. Now, if I combine them, and let's say they have a value of 15,000, 20,000 apiece. If I combine them, I've created additional square footage. I've created, and by creating additional square footage, I could now possibly, the highest and best use now could be a subsequent retail establishment related to my existing gas station. And as a result, the buyer, the owner of A, might be interested in B and C as additional square footage for the expansion of their business. Hence, you get the increase in value through increased square footage, or i.e. the joining of those two properties. And not to get too complicated, but it could also be an easement that the parcel A may need egress from the back of his or her property, or additional parking for that property that would create value for the existing business.
Okay, thank you. And one more, can you explain more about why the sales comparison approach is the approach to valuation that's most closely related to substitution?
Yes, the sales comparison, let's go with substitution. So substitution is the principle that says no one reasonably is going to pay more for a property than what they can build that property for. And so an appraiser is normally going to look at existing properties as a benchmark, and to say that existing properties, what has sold, is the perfect substitution for a subject property. It's the perfect comparison to say, if this property was no longer there, what other comparables would be likely used? So it's simply a way of saying, in the substitution environment, or a substitution of a property, what similar properties exist that could be a good comparable to this property.
Okay, thank you. It looks like we've covered all of our questions. Vincent, is there anything else you wanted to cover before I wrap up?
Other than saying that the key to understanding real estate and being successful in real estate is understanding these principles of value. A good professional agent is going to need these tools in assisting a seller or a buyer to determine the most likely price to facilitate a sale. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone. We appreciate you being here. I'd like to thank Vincent for joining us today. We truly appreciate your willingness to share your knowledge and expertise with us. So look for an email from us with a link to today's recorded session, and keep an eye out for invites to additional webinars in the near future. When this webinar ends, we invite you to complete a survey. If you're able to take a minute, we'd love your feedback so we can continue to provide valuable webinars to you. Thanks again for joining us today, and we will see you next time.